If one only measures these things in kilometres on a map, the front lines of Ukraine are a long way from the frictions of Southeast Asia. Recent events have reminded, however, that the two theatres are closer than they might look. Earlier this week in Seoul, Russia's ambassador to South Korea was summoned for one of those meetings at which biscuits are not offered. South Korea's foreign ministry wished to express its extreme displeasure at the reported presence of North Korean troops in Russia, possibly en route to reinforcing Russia's rampage in Ukraine. China, meanwhile, has been keeping a very close eye on Ukraine since Russia launched its full-scale assault in February 2022, looking for clues as to how the world might respond should Beijing decide to act on its long-simmering ambition of reincorporating Taiwan into the motherland, however little Taiwan's actual people might fancy this outcome. And Japan, which votes in a general election on Sunday, sees the defence of Ukraine as a defence of the Western-led order which has underpinned Japan's own security since the end of World War II. In an increasingly fractious neighbourhood, Japan remains constitutionally prohibited from asserting itself as a traditional military power. Is there a realistic prospect of European troops exchanging fire with North Korean soldiers? Have Russia's travails in Ukraine made China any less likely to try its luck with Taiwan? And could the looming presidential election in the United States compel everyone to rethink everything? This is the Foreign Desk.
The North Koreans appear to have decided that they are never going to be able to form any kind of worthwhile relationship with the United States, and that therefore they need to reinforce success. They've got good relations with China, increasingly warm relations with Russia. That's where you go, and that means that you don't need to be nice to South Korea anymore.
Great powers don't tend to let other countries have bases in their countries or put their forces under the command of others. So on the outside, when people are assessing the China-Russia relationship, they tend to discount it. But historically, that was never going to be the case. The real question is, are the Chinese better prepared to fight wars because of this relationship with Russia? And is Russia better prepared to fight wars because of their relationship with China?
The feeling, to a large extent, is that Japan got off quite lightly with Trump the first time. Under Prime Minister Abe, he did everything to build a close personal relationship with Trump. The concern is, what would happen this time?
Welcome to the Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Muller. I'm joined, first of all, here in the studio by John Everard, former British ambassador to North Korea. John, first of all, it appears clear that North Korean troops are in Russia. We're not entirely sure whether they have been or are being sent to Ukraine. But nevertheless, from North Korea's point of view, what kind of sense does this deployment make? What's in it for them?
Firstly, North Korea will have exacted a price for sending any troops into Russia. We don't know what that price is. The fear in South Korea is that it might include technical transfers that have been banned so far, including perhaps help with building a North Korean nuclear-powered submarine, which would badly tilt the balance of power around the peninsula, and perhaps too in perfecting ICBMs. And it may be telling that just 2 days ago, Kim Jong-un went to visit his ICBM site and encouraged the troops there to continue modernising their equipment. The other thing that North Korea gets directly from this kind of involvement is simply experience. I mean, for all its bragging, you have to remember that the North Korean military hasn't fought a war since the Korean War. They have no idea what a modern war looks like. And this has given them battlefield experience by proxy, sure, but at least they get to see what these weapons look like when they're used.
If we are working on the assumption, though, that they will be sent anywhere near the fighting, isn't this a bit... Well, wouldn't North Korea regard this as a bit of a risk? Because they would be allowing thousands of North Korean troops within, not easy, but certainly within defecting range of Europe.
Whoa, okay, let's roll back a bit. Do we assume that they're going near the fighting? I don't think that is necessarily the case. I think it's quite possible that if the reports are true, and there are big question marks over all these sources, that the North Korean troops would take up rear positions, back of the line, thus freeing up Russian Russian troops to go to the front line, not that the North Korean troops themselves would be put into the front line. But if we take your hypothesis that they do actually end up in the front line, then yes, this gets seriously risky. Risky for all kinds of reasons. Number one, that they prove to be absolutely useless. This is one of the big worries that keeps Kim Jong-un awake at night, that and his nicotine addiction, that his military that he spent so much money on, lavished so much TLC over, isn't actually up to snuff. And if faced with Ukrainian machine guns, they simply run, then he's going to look pretty stupid. Two, as you point out, a risk of desertions. There is a serious risk that if you put North Koreans anywhere near somewhere where they can just walk across, you'll find the nearest big bit of white material they can, find a Ukrainian position, smile broadly and say, take me to South Korea, they'll do so. There was an unconfirmed report about, a week, 10 days ago, that 18 North Korean soldiers had already done precisely this. And they'd been stopped by the Russians and presumably had their ears boxed. But there is a risk that they might do so in large numbers. Mass defections of North Korean troops would be horribly embarrassing for Kim Jong-un, both in terms of his own domestic prestige and, of course, in terms of his relationship with Vladimir Putin. So it would be a high-risk strategy.
Well, even if we go by the most benign analysis of North Korea's deployment to Russia, and this is the line certainly that the Kremlin is pushing, that this is a routine cooperation between military allies, not really any more or less sinister than, for example, the United States deploying troops in Poland or Romania. But even if that's all it is, what's our sense of how delighted South Korea is by this development?
Delighted isn't the word that springs to mind. Remember that South Korea is under a very conservative, well right-of-centre president whose views on North Korea are generally unprintable. And they have already, some of the Russian ambassador protested, demanded that if there are any North Korean troops in Russia, that they are withdrawn immediately, and told the Russians in no uncertain terms that this is a red line, that if you have North Korean troops in Russia, then the kind of self-denying ordinance that South Korea has applied to itself not to supply lethal aid to Ukraine, that goes out of the window. Now, if that happens, that's a game changer. South Korea has one of the most modern, most developed and most sophisticated arms industries in the world and is capable of producing high-quality munitions, weaponry, whatever you want, at speed, at reasonable cost for Ukraine. Compared to the kind of perhaps less high-quality munitions that the North Koreans are providing to Russia, the South Koreans are way ahead. And if this kind of stuff, if it landed in quantities in the hands of Ukrainians, would shift the battlefield.
You're quite right to point out that South Korea has a substantial and much admired armaments industry, and South Korea has, of course, been a major supplier to Poland during its current build-up, notably with K2 Black Panther tanks, FA-50 fighter jets. If South Korea were to determine that their response to this red line being crossed would be to supply kit of that quality and in that quantity to Ukraine, would that be popular in South Korea?
It would make a lot of money. That would be popular. Curiously, the South Korean response to all of this has been very muted. I mean, you've had a spate of media comments and so on and so forth, but you haven't had the kind of popular swell of anxiety that you might have thought this sort of move would provoke. The South Koreans seem to think that Ukraine is a long way away. If their government can find markets for their arms, that's fine. It's unlikely to affect their lives.
Would there be any part of thinking in Seoul that is not displeased, though, that the conflict with North Korea has become somewhat internationalized, that this now has greater global attention because North Korea has sent troops to Russia?
Absolutely. The Koreans worry that because of Ukraine, because of Gaza coming to that world attention has shifted from the Korean Peninsula, which remains a tinderbox. It could go at any time. And they want the world to watch them, to support them, and to intervene to prevent the sparks flying. So, yes, I'm sure there's a certain amount of quiet satisfaction in the corridors of power in Seoul. Probably also in the corridors of power of Kiev. On the other side of the fence, this, for the Ukrainians, represents a further globalization of their war, draws in more powers, makes it bigger and more important, and lowers the risk that they get forgotten in the excitement of Gaza.
That statement about the Korean Peninsula being a tinderbox is something that could have been uttered with more or less accuracy for most of the last 70 years. If we compare the current situation against the previous 7 decades, how dangerous would you assess it is right now?
quite a lot more dangerous. You're right. I mean, the Korean Peninsula, ever since the armistice that ended the Korean War was signed, has gone through various phases of varying amounts of instability. But for a long time, the situation really was quite manageable. I mean, under Kim Il-sung, he'd had his go at the South. Everybody understood he wasn't going to have a go again. Kim Jong-il had no such intentions. And in the early years of Kim Jong-un, there were great hopes that the whole situation could in fact be resolved. It's really over the last, 5 years, that things have got really hairy. Ever since the collapse of, can you call it détente, the rather curious summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump in Singapore 2018, and in particular the collapse of the summit in Hanoi, the North Koreans appear to have decided that they are never going to be able to form any kind of worthwhile relationship with the United States. The United States is going to remain inveterately hostile, and that therefore they need to reinforce success. They've got good relations with China, increasingly warm relations with Russia. That's where you go. And that means that you don't need to be nice to South Korea anymore. So we're getting a stream of bellicose rhetoric, Kim Jong-un making thinly veiled threats to attack the South using nuclear weapons, and any attempt to push back against that is met by screaming fits by his hysterical sister.
That idea that North Korea may have, that there is no prospect of a constructive, amicable, non-hostile relationship with the United States, do you think that remains their view regardless of the outcome on election day? Is there any part of them that wants Trump back, or might they think, well, a President Kamala Harris, she doesn't like us any better than any of the others, but at least we kind of know what we're dealing with?
Late last year, the number 2 in the North Korean embassy in Cuba defected, a man called Ri Eun-gyu. He's given various interviews to the media. One of the things he said was that he knows that Kim Jong-un's grand plan, if you can call it that, is that when the Ukraine war ends, and with it this great flow of goodies from Russia, that he will attempt to squeeze more goodies out of President Trump, somehow leverage his relationship, such as it is, with the president to solve North Korea's economic problems, which of course raises huge questions. What if President Trump isn't re-elected? There is a free election coming after all. And why does he think that President Trump would be amenable to such leverage? And why does he think that he'd show such generosity? Not much of a plan, if you ask me. But yes, I mean, it seems clear from that kind of remark that the North Koreans are rather counting on a second President Trump, and that they're hoping too that he'll be nice to them.
And dare we hazard a guess as to what result South Korea might prefer to wake up to?
President Trump has repeatedly tried to squeeze more money out of South Korea as a contribution to the stationing of US troops there. And the negotiations over that have been really quite uncomfortable, or were uncomfortable under his first term. Moreover, the South Koreans, although they tend to prefer Republicans in general, seem to have gotten on much better with President Biden than they ever got on with President Trump. So although they're very carefully not saying anything in public, I suspect that they would welcome a Harris presidency.
John, thanks as always. That was John Everard, former British ambassador to Belarus, Uruguay and North Korea. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. I'm joined now by Oriana Skylar Mastro, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and author of the new book, Upstart, How China Became a Great Power. Oriana, I want to go back to the beginning of 2022, when President Vladimir Putin of Russia famously visited China shortly before ordering the invasion of Ukraine. This was presumably to reassure China that the whole thing wasn't going to take terribly long. Do we get the feeling that China's thinking on Ukraine has evolved since then? Are they still as patient with Russia?
Well, I think first and foremost, we're not 100% sure what was said between Putin and Xi at that meeting. Another interpretation that I got from people in China from interacting with some of my colleagues there was that Putin didn't tell Xi explicitly what was going to be done, only that he wanted to deal with the issue, that Xi probably assumed some sort of limited use of force, but that it was not expected the level of this operation. That the Chinese, I think, like a lot of the world, was expecting more of a Crimea type of situation in which it wasn't going to be a large-scale conventional conflict. And so given that, I think the Chinese, from almost day one of the war, it didn't take the Russians kind of getting bogged down in Ukraine and it getting significantly protracted for the Chinese to start to think, oh, wait, this is not exactly what we thought this was going to look like. And then after, the protraction, the initial stages, there was a lot of pressure on China of whether or not they sort of quote unquote allowed the Russians to do this. They've been trying to do this balancing act that's new with this war than previous wars, because in the past, the Chinese were actually very neutral. With Georgia and Crimea, if you look at the statements coming out of China, it was sort of very much on the sidelines. With Ukraine, they did this thing where they wanted to exploit it, I think, to warn the West on Taiwan. So on one hand, they're like, okay, we're totally neutral on this, but also this is what happens when you violate the security interests of great powers. And they didn't do a great job at squaring that circle. And I think that's what has thrown us all into this tizzy, not only about what does it mean for Taiwan, but very focused on, wait, like, does China support Russia? Do they not support Russia? Like, what is going on in that relationship?
But as well as a warning to the West in that respect, i.e. don't meddle in the backyards of great powers, this is what will happen, is there any level at which China has been watching Russia's adventure in Ukraine as kind of a lesson to itself, i.e. these are the risks and the pitfalls of launching a war of conquest?
So, Andrew, I don't want to exaggerate this, but I think it's necessary, given this narrative that we have in the West, to say no. Because we have this narrative that, oh, China is sitting back, like Xi Jinping thinks if Putin's reign is at risk, Xi Jinping's reign is at risk. If Russia has trouble in Ukraine, that means China's going to have trouble in Taiwan. I mean, there's really no parallel on the operational military level between these things. And also on the strategic level, Ukraine is not an ally of the United States. The United States has been very clear about its commitment to Taiwan. Operationally, like, Taiwan is an air and sea battle. Ukraine is a ground battle. There are no options to, for example, equip Taiwan just with, weapons while they fight the Chinese while we're afar, like we're doing with Ukraine. Initially, when that invasion happened, of course, the Chinese pay attention to all wars all around the world, and they assessed them, and they assessed why the Russians had issues. And it was basically command and control, logistics, and lack of munitions. They have no problem with munitions, so they kind of ruled that out. Now, command and control and logistics are issues for the People's Liberation Army, but those are issues that they identified over a decade ago, and that the whole reorganization that perhaps you've covered on this show before, since 2013, is designed to really deal with. So the Chinese always knew that they wanted to have strong command and control and logistics before they did anything against Taiwan. That's the only reason they haven't done anything against Taiwan. And when Xi Jinping tells them to be ready by 2027, that's what they're trying to get ready. So maybe the Russian struggles highlighted even more so the importance of these factors. So China wanted to be really certain about its C2, and now they want to be really, really certain about their C2. But it wasn't a game changer in the way that maybe some people in the West think it would have been.
So there's no sense at all in which China would have looked at the world's response to Ukraine, and especially the United States' response to Ukraine, to think, well, maybe this gives us some idea about how they might respond to an attempt by China to take Taiwan?
Well, first, let me just point out that everything that we have done in the West failed to deter the Russian invasion of Ukraine and continues to fail to compel them to leave. So it has not been enough. Now, if the Chinese are looking at that, the first question is, do they look at that and think, that is too costly for me? The Russian economy has suffered maybe a 2 to 3% decrease in GDP. That would not be enough to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So even they were surprised with the level of our response. And there was a lot of writing at the time of, if the West is going to do things that are different than what they say they're going to do, maybe they want to let us know ahead of time, in case it shapes our thinking. So that line of thought was definitely there. But the Chinese always have expected, for example, a degree of economic sanctioning against them if they use force. That's why they've made in China 2025 to try to get key industries to be domestic only. The overland pipelines to Russia and the Belt and Road Initiative are all about having overland routes to gain energy in markets in case they're blockaded. So they've always had this in the back of their mind and they're preparing for it. And then the last thing I will say is that while countries maybe were willing to sanction Russia, I mean, it did take everyone a really long time to get there. And it hasn't been to the degree that was necessary to actually invoke a change in Russian thinking. But even so, a lot of senior leaders then have gone to China and basically have communicated, we wouldn't do that to you, China. Right. And so just because some countries, the Singaporeans, I always use them as an example, they were so proud they were sanctioning Russia, and that's great. But I think their trade with Russia is, I don't know, like an 80th of what their trade with China is. And then when I go into the region and I ask in Singapore and Japan and Korea, even in European countries, when President Macron basically goes over to China and says, don't worry, we're independent of the United States. China is not getting the message that the world is going to stop trading with them if they take Taiwan by force.
So if China thinks that the two situations are maybe not as linked as a lot of Western media and Western policymakers might suppose, would China take any view at all on the recent development of North Korean troops being reported in Russia? Again, we don't really know yet for what ultimate purpose. Would that perturb China in the slightest?
So the short answer to that is yes, but let me just go back to the statement you made before. To be clear, what I'm arguing is it doesn't impact Chinese thinking about themselves, their own capabilities, and what would happen to them in that scenario. But they very much recognize that this war has impacted other actors. For example, Taiwan. In Taiwan, the impact of the war in Ukraine has been significant. And a couple of years ago, when I would go meet with the leadership, we'd still have this debate about whether Taiwan needed certain asymmetric defensive capabilities, whether the threat of China was real. That debate is over. Now, since the invasion of Ukraine, the senior leadership in Taiwan takes very seriously the likelihood of a Chinese invasion, and they have been completely on board with developing more of the asymmetric systems that would be needed to stop that invasion. So the Chinese see that. They see how Ukraine has impacted thinking in other places, and they do not like it. Along those lines are the relationships between Russia and countries like North Korea or Iran. And it's clear that the Chinese feel very uncomfortable with the closeness between those two countries. And I actually recently, just this week, met with some high-level Chinese government officials and asked them about it. And they said, listen, we understand why Russia and North Korea, they feel the outside pressure from the United States, so they need to help each other build that military capability. But it's bad for China. It's bad for China because they don't like that degree of Russian influence in North Korea. This official said to me, even in the six-party talks, the Russians didn't have a significant role. They shouldn't have a significant role in that peninsula. We don't like them having a role there. So it's not only about Russian influence, but it's also about the fact that the more the Western world sees them as a bloc, the more pressure allies and partners are willing to put on China. I think that fear in Beijing is correct, that the United States can then go to European countries and say, I know you don't want to get involved in security issues in Asia, but this isn't about Asia. Like, look at Russia and China's relationship. We go to the South Koreans, we're like, we know you don't want to get involved in this thing with China, but look at China and North Korea. So the more those countries come closer together, the easier it is for the United States to rally allies and partners. And the Chinese recognize that. And that's why they have not been supportive of that relationship. When the first meeting happened, the Chinese response was like, we have nothing to do with that. Like, don't look over here. We have nothing to do with that. We don't think it's a good idea. Countries shouldn't get involved in other countries' wars. And so they're very worried about the direction, I think, that those relationships are taking.
Obviously, another factor about to descend upon us is the presidential election in the United States. Would China, do you think, have a preferred outcome? Might there be something about the isolationist tendency that arrays itself behind Donald Trump that appeals to them?
Well, the Chinese are being very careful right now. They don't want to voice any opinion on this in any of the exchanges I have with them because they want to show they're not like Russia. They're not interfering in the US election. I do think there is a strand that is genuine in which they don't really see a fundamental difference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris when it comes to their expectations for competition between the United States and China. They think both individuals would continue this competitive trajectory. However, to your question, one of the things that Biden has been relatively successful at that probably Vice President Harris would continue is the strengthening of relations with allies and partners. President Trump, whether it is because of isolationist tendencies or personalities or what have you, any indication from his first administration will tell you that he's not going to have great relations with those allies and partners. And so the Chinese, I think, are hopeful that some of the more coordinated pressure against them would cease under President Trump. But if you take it to the extreme, that isolationist assumption, even if the United States would have to be so convincing, a US president would have to be so convincing to say, we do not care about Taiwan. You can take it. We will not do anything. We promise. Like we're pulling out our forces to show how credible we are. Like we've done this before, right? The war in Iraq, the Gulf War, in which the senior US leader was like, I don't know about Kuwait. And then it was invaded. We did this before in Korea, in which Dean Acheson made a speech and was like, Korea's not really in the defense perimeter. And then the North Koreans and the Soviet Union was like, okay, great, we can do this. And then America was like, oh, wait, we changed our mind. So I don't think the Chinese can rely on that isolationist tendency in the short term, like for 4 years, to really shape their thinking about the costs of a conflict over Taiwan. But they are excited, perhaps, about the prospect of U.S. allies and partners not being so thrilled with the United States anymore.
I mean, just as a final thought, and it brings us back a bit to where we came in, that relationship between Russia and China, just thinking about what you were saying about how China is a bit cagey about being backed into the idea that it is part of any sort of alliance with these countries. Does China regard Russia as an actual ally or a friend in any meaningful sense?
Well, when it comes to Chinese thinking on alliances, they have a very different thought process than the United States, right? So I have this book, Upstart, How China Became a Great Power, in which I talk about how China really approaches things in many ways differently than the United States. And one is that they don't have traditional alliances. And part of the reason is they felt like the United States got all the good allies. Part of it is they didn't want other U.S. allies and partners. They recognized that having good, especially economic relations with allies and partners, in particular the European Union, which is their number one trading partner, is so critical. So what they want from Russia is not a mutual defense type of scenario, because also great powers don't really do that. But they want the Russians to help them build their own independent military capabilities to deal with the United States. And the Russians have been doing that historically. And so that is really what that relationship is about. Great powers don't tend to let other countries have bases in their countries or put their forces under the command of others. So on the outside, when people are assessing the China-Russia relationship, they tend to discount it because it doesn't look like the US-UK relationship, for example. But historically, that was never going to be the case. The real question is, are the Chinese better prepared to fight wars because of this relationship with Russia? And is Russia better prepared to fight wars because of their relationship with China? And besides the independent military capabilities, one thing is abundantly clear. Their willingness to continue to support each other during wars reduces our ability to coerce them, either to not fight or to stop fighting, because they have this kind of strategic rear of support, whether it be energy, economic support, weapons, equipment in some areas. The Russians are more willing to provide that to the Chinese than the other way around. But it makes it harder for us in the West to exact some sort of punishment against these countries if they have each other. And so I think the relationship becomes particularly useful in protracted conflicts. And we're seeing that right now, that even with this indirect, in some ways, and limited support that the Chinese are providing Russia, it does make a huge difference to their ability to continue fighting.
Oriana Skylar Mastro, thank you very much for joining us on the Foreign Desk. Oriana's new book, Upstart, How China Became a Great Power, is in shops now. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Finally, on today's show, to Japan, which votes on Sunday. Earlier, I spoke with James D. Brown, Professor of Political Science at Temple University's Japan campus and an expert on Russia-Japan relations. I began by asking about the current Prime Minister, Shigeru Ishiba, though he hasn't been there long, and whether, as a former defence minister, he takes a more hawkish line on defence and security matters than his predecessors or potential successors.
I think the best way of framing it is not necessarily that he's more hawkish, but rather he's more knowledgeable and more interested in this issue. Sometimes we've had Japanese prime ministers in the past who, frankly, haven't been that knowledgeable or focused on defense issues. However, with Ishiba Shigeru, he's a self-described defense geek. He has been defense minister in the past. He's really interested and knowledgeable about the minutiae of defense issues. So he's not necessarily more hawkish than any of his predecessors, but he knows what he's talking about.
Japan in particular has been reasonably supportive of Ukraine, obviously to the exclusion of sending obviously lethal equipment. Has that been a factor in this campaign at all? Is it a topic of public discussion?
No, interestingly, not at all. Japan hasn't gone as far as many Western countries, but from Japan's standards, it's done really quite a lot in terms of its financial support for Ukraine, its introduction of widespread sanctions against Russia, and also providing military equipment, albeit not weapons. And yet, in the run-up to this election, that has not featured at all. There are one or two politicians who are sort of more pro-Russian in their outlook, but the entire mainstream of Japanese politics, whether opposition parties or the ruling coalition, are in agreement that it's essential for Japan, as well as for the international order, to support Ukraine. So no, it's not been really a matter for debate.
Is it just about upholding the international order as far as Japan's concerned, though, or does it sort of see in the Donbass an echo of the Kuril Islands dispute? Because obviously Russia claims a couple of islands quite close to Japan's northern tip that Japan also claims for itself.
Yeah, well, that's right. That there are some parallels in that regard. In fact, the Ukrainian ambassador to Japan just this week was talking about the similar situation of Ukraine and Japan, in that both have some of their territory which is under Russian occupation. However, when it comes to Japan's support for Ukraine, that's motivated less by the dispute over the Northern Islands and actually much more to do with the Taiwan issue. So the reason why Japanese politicians have been so focused on this is their belief that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. That's a slogan of the previous prime minister, Kishida. It's been taken up by the current prime minister as well. And what they're thinking about there is, if Russia can succeed in changing the status quo by force in Europe, could that send the message to China that they could achieve the same thing in taking Taiwan by force? So that's actually the main motivating factor, rather than Japan's own territorial dispute.
That being the case, has there been any discussion either within Japan or among Japan and its neighbours about a more formalised security architecture, something like an Asia-Pacific NATO? I mean, Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand have been to recent NATO summits. It's almost as if they're trying to learn something.
Yeah, so that was one of the most prominent things in the lead up to the leadership election that brought Ishiba to the position of prime minister. It was him raising the idea of an Asian NATO. Now, that was essentially campaign talk, but there is something more serious here, which is Japan's evolution as a security actor, going from a consumer of security, just benefiting from the security commitments provided by the United States, to actually playing a bigger regional, and at one point in the future, perhaps global role, where Japan will make its own security commitments to other countries. So to clarify that a little bit, at the moment, Japan's alliance with the United States is one way. You have the United States promising to defend Japan, but if the United States itself is attacked, Japan doesn't have to do anything. So in that case, it's very different from NATO and Article 5. So Ishiba's suggestion there is to make a more equal relationship with the United States, perhaps, but also with other countries within the region. However, that is an enormous leap for Japan. It would entail Japan needing to have the capabilities and, crucially, the will to actually fight to defend other countries. Let's say, South Korea, Philippines, Australia. And currently, that's a long way away. So I think Asian NATO is an interesting idea. It's something which kind of shows Japan's evolution as a security actor, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Something which is happening now is Japan's cooperation with the existing NATO. Now, Japan's obviously not going to become a member of NATO, but one of the key features of Japan's security behavior of recent times has been to complement the alliance with the United States by building security partnerships with other like-minded countries. And that's principally been NATO members. So in recent years, we've had, visits from military assets, ships from the UK, France, Germany, Canada, and that's something which is important development for Japan.
Has there been generally, though, James, any recent evolution, maybe even during this election campaign, in Japan's thinking about changing its constitution to enable it to behave as a normal military power, which was, of course, always one of the great dreams of the late Shinzo Abe?
Yeah, that's right. So it remains very much the goal of the Liberal Democratic Party. In fact, that has been the policy position of the LDP since that party was formed in 1955. So there's no variation in their ambitions. They want to change the constitution. They want to revise Article 9, which sets out that Japan renounces war and also commits to not having land, sea and air forces. They want to do it, but actually in the run-up to this election, it's not been a big talking point. The reason for that is to change the constitution, a very divisive issue within Japan. You need to have a clear majority. You need to be a strong prime minister who can force this through against significant opposition. However, with this election, everyone expects that the LDP is going to lose a significant number of seats. The real debate is if they can maintain their majority. So even though it remains their ambition to change the constitution, they are not going to be in a position to do so.
And James, there is another election coming up, which is obviously going to be extremely important to Japan, and possibly even arguably in terms of its security, not much less important than its own election, which is the presidential election in the United States. Was that a topic during this campaign, and is it a topic of discussion among the Japanese political classes, i.e., what do we do if the Americans re-elect Trump?
This has been a leading topic of debate in Japan all year. And the feeling, to a large extent, is that Japan got off quite lightly with Trump the first time. Under Prime Minister Abe, he did everything to build a close personal relationship with Trump. He really tried to charm him, and he seemed to do a pretty good job of ensuring that Trump didn't do anything very negative towards Japan, for example, withdrawing large numbers of US troops from bases within Japan. The concern is, what would happen this time? This would be Japan having to deal with Trump without Abe. Had he still been alive, he could have played a sort of older statesman role, special envoy to the United States. He's not here anymore. So a big concern is who would play that Abe role? And frankly, there's no one who is a natural fit for it. So that's a major concern. So if Trump were to be elected, they would have to find someone to do that. And in addition to that, they would try and find ways to keep the White House happy. And the most obvious way of doing that is economically and financially, something in the trade area to, increase purchases of certain US kind of goods, perhaps a big weapons deal. And in addition to that, perhaps increasing the contribution that Japan makes to the cost of US bases within Japan.
If there is, though, uncertainty in Japan about the future of the American security relationship, which has been the bedrock of Japan's security situation since the end of the Second World War, is there any discussion at all about what I'm aware is a very live third rail in Japanese politics, which is the idea of Japan becoming a nuclear-armed power itself? There is sensitivity about this in Japan for extremely obvious reasons, but Japan is one of those countries that could do it if it wanted to.
Japanese politicians are very aware of this. Most of them refuse to discuss it precisely because, as you note, it's so sensitive. But once in a while, you get a little hint that they are really thinking about it. And the suggestion in recent times has not been so much that Japan would go so far as to develop its own nuclear weapons straight away, but rather as an initial step, they might agree to host US nuclear weapons. That's been something that for decades Japan has not been willing to accept. It's had its so-called 3 non-nuclear principles, which include that they would not allow nuclear weapons to be introduced. So the suggestion has been, and this was raised by Abe before his death, was that Japan could have a nuclear sharing arrangement with the United States, similar to what exists in European countries. That is, that they would be US nuclear weapons based on Japanese soil, but they would not be under Japan's direct control. So that's been discussed. Beyond that, would Japan at some point develop its own nuclear weapons? Well, we have to consider that as a possibility, given the very high level of insecurity that Japanese policymakers think. And actually, the Prime Minister, Ishiba, a long time ago, he suggested that part of the reason why Japan wants to maintain its civilian nuclear infrastructure, its nuclear power plants, is as a tacit nuclear deterrent, very strongly hinting that by having that control of the nuclear fuel cycle, by having that nuclear expertise, it would allow Japan to have breakout capacity. It would allow Japan, if necessary, to develop nuclear weapons quickly.
That was James D. Brown of Temple University's Japan campus speaking to us on the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for the Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Jack Dewars. Elliot Greenfield produced this week's Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.